stay tuned because for the next 60 minutes, Motorsports Unlimited is on the air. Hi, I'm Jerry Bryant, and these are the lovely ladies of motorsports. And all this hour, we're going to have 60 minutes of action-packed excitement. All kinds of exciting things will happen. And we got the famous Bill Wildt, and we got all kinds of other good stuff that's happening all this hour. Motorsports Unlimited, 60 minutes of non-stop action. So let's go to the studio right now, huh?
Thanks, Jerry, and hi, everybody. Welcome to the studio headquarters of Chicagoland's most watched, most talked about Access television series. I'm Bill Wildt, and this is the 1427th edition of Motorsports Unlimited, titled Explanation 19. Today we continue our explanation of what Motorsports Unlimited has been all about for the past 30-plus years. As explained many times, our interest is the survival of motorsport and all of the attendant things that activity provides. We will continue that discussion on this episode, but it's a little difficult to introduce because we will be picking up on what we started in the last episode, Explanation 18. Hopefully you will recall I was in the middle of explaining my involvement with Turbonique engines. And if you don't recall or didn't see episode 18, it's available on YouTube. As a matter of fact, I had just finished explaining what happened when I began test firing the two Turbonique thrust motors I acquired and tested on the mobile test stand I'd built in the back of a van. I explained how the first tests were conducted literally in my backyard and caused quite a stir in the neighborhood, including irate neighbors as well as significant police attention. These rocket motors were the most powerful Turbonique ever manufactured, so I guess I shouldn't have been surprised at how loud they were. I mean, they were only running at half power, just 2 of the 4 fuel injectors in each motor operating. I actually had to give it some thought. I'd seen the Lightning Bug run years before, and it was powered by the 1,000 horsepower shaft output Turbonique motor. It's possible I didn't remember how loud it was, or that the sound in a wide open area like Oswego Dragway dissipates better than in a suburban neighborhood. But it seems to me the Lightning Bug was nowhere near as loud as these thrust motors. I do remember things like that. Then it occurred to me. The 1,000 horsepower motor in the Lightning Bug was a shaft output motor, and much like a turbocharged motor, the turbine absorbs much of the sound like a big muffler. The motors I was testing were thrust motors, meaning they weren't spinning a turbine wheel. One gets to hear the full fury and sound of the explosion in the combustion chambers. Damn, I thought, I didn't think of that. They really were loud, and that was at half power. I knew I had to find a different test firing area. Fortunately, about 10 minutes from my home, there was a huge railroad facility. I'm not a railroad guy, so I don't know exactly what they do there, but part of it must be maintenance. This means there are large numbers of rail cars and engines parked for long periods of time. In my judgment, one could set up a bomb there and no one would notice. Just what I was looking for. One particular spot appealed to me for my purposes. It was right alongside the roadway, and for some reason there was a huge boulder, at least the size of a car, near the edge of the road. This was perfect for what I had in mind. First of all, during the test firings I'd done at home, I learned these were serious motors. I've ridden some seriously powerful motorcycles in my time, but as I was testing these motors, I couldn't help but think about actually throwing my leg over a bike with these motors for power. After hearing and feeling them run, I knew I was going to have to develop real confidence in them, which meant many more tests. And I immediately made one change after the tests in my backyard, a longer remote button cable, because I said to myself, until I fully understand the behavior of these engines, I needed to take cover while test firing them. Yes, these motors were intimidating. The boulder looked like the perfect cover I needed when I pushed the button. Yes, that's right, I wanted a place to protect myself if anything went wrong. The motors got my respect during initial testing, and that was only half power. I wasn't sure what to expect at full power, but my nature to work carefully dictated a couple of changes in test procedure after experiencing the first couple of tests. Having said all that, it was time to get back to work. My plan was to make the next test with a third fuel injector in each engine. That will make 3 out of 4 operational. By the way, small changes like this are not exactly easy. If I wanted to use just one injector in each engine, in addition to the start fuel system, I guess that means 2 injectors in each engine, because the start fuel system is just splitting off the injector in each engine. Well, anyway, It took a different fuel manifold which had to be made just for the test. If all went well, the next step would be 2 additional injectors in each engine, a different fuel manifold. Here is a picture of one of the manifolds. Now you might think, big deal, you're a welder, knock it out. That's exactly what I thought until I made one and decided to test it first. Oh, I'm not talking about fill it with water and see if it leaks. That's easy. And of course I did that. I'm a good welder and I TIG weld almost everything. But it occurred to me that I wouldn't be putting water in the manifold, I'd be putting rocket fuel in it. More than that, it would be under significant pressure, at least 300 pounds. That meant it should be tested to at least 400 pounds. No big deal, right? Well, you have no idea what happens when you start putting it under pressure. Oh sure, 50, 60 pounds, even 100 pounds, easy. But you would be surprised at what happens when the pressure goes past 150 pounds, 200 pounds, 250 pounds. You start seeing tiny little, almost not perceivable leaks that create a very fine stream of mist in the air. Not a big deal until you realize it could be a stream of rocket fuel looking for a hot surface. I always thought I was a good welder until I found out how difficult it was to weld up a manifold that would test to 600 pounds. You see, one of the real challenges of working with rockets is recognizing they consume an enormous amount of fuel under very high pressure. If you think about it, they have to. All the power any engine makes comes from the fuel. It's the only part of the engine that has BTUs. Making power takes fuel. These particular engines are designed to produce 6,640 horsepower while consuming a gallon of fuel per second. More about this later. The point is, everything in the fuel system has to be capable of dealing with high pressure. Oh yeah, my next test. I set everything up in the van, or should I say, mobile test station, and proceeded to what is called the Bensenville freight yards. I don't know why they call them that, but everybody does. I don't even know if it's Bensenville or a freight yard, or what that means. Anyway, whatever it was, it's completely different now. This was 40 years ago. I carefully pulled the nose of my van up to the boulder alongside of the road. Not just up to the boulder, but against it. This was going to be a 3/4 power test, and it was the first time. I really didn't know what to expect. I figured the boulder was an excellent wheel chock as well as a safe place for me to get behind. I went through the routine. I went through it on the last episode, but I'll quickly run through it again. After setting up the 8mm movie camera on the tripod, I prepared the engines for firing. First, I preset the oxygen pressure to 275 pounds and checked for leaks. Then the fuel pressure to 300 pounds and checked for leaks. I switched on the ignition system and listened at each rocket nozzle to be sure all the spark plugs were buzzing. I grabbed the remote push button and, after turning on the 8mm movie camera, I ducked behind the shoulder, remote push button in hand. One glance at everything, and I pushed the button. Boom! It always surprised me. I know all the permission steps built into the system, and I know it takes time, but when you push the button, it seems to go boom immediately. It was loud, but this area didn't amplify the sound. It was loud and intimidating, and the van was shaking violently, but it was over in a few seconds. All the gauges have a tattletale needle, and a quick glance satisfied me that everything did what it was supposed to do. Of course, I couldn't tell if everything happened in correct sequence until I could see the 8mm film of the gauges. Right now, I had to get the heck out of there. Even in this remote area, someone might have heard the explosion and called the cops. Or it was possible a passing police car might get curious. I did what I had to do. Now it was time to go home and check everything over. Every test seemed to give me something to think about. During the first couple of tests at home, I only put in about a gallon or so of fuel. I had the fuel supply in a 55-gallon steel drum, and it was a pain in the butt to get it out and into a transfer container to transfer the fuel to the 5-gallon tank in the van test stand. I've forgotten now, but the fuel reacts to lots of materials, so I had to be careful what I used. Unfortunately, the 55-gallon drum full of fuel was very heavy, and it wasn't a matter of tipping the drum and pouring out some fuel. I tried several different pumps that claimed to be tolerant of acid, etc., but I wasn't convinced, and I didn't want to contaminate the fuel via eating up the insides of the pump or eating at the containers used for fuel transfer. I never really solved this problem, and if I could find more fuel or have more made, I'd figure out something better. As it was, I worked quickly and didn't let the fuel touch anything for very long. I just transferred exactly what I planned on using for the test. It is a bad idea to try and stop and restart these motors once they are running because of the problem of momentary failure to fire. while the first test at home only involved one injector in each motor and 2 fuel injectors in each motor in the second test. In this test, each motor had 3 fuel injectors operational, and I was more than a little surprised at how quickly the test was over. When the motor stopped, I didn't realize they had used all of the fuel I provided. I didn't know exactly how much fuel I put in, but it was more than the tests at home. I didn't want to put in too much because I had to drive the van for 10 minutes to get to this spot. I still didn't know if it was a good idea to carry it in a vehicle. I figured if there wasn't that much, it couldn't do that much damage if something went wrong during transport. One thing was sure, even though I didn't know exactly how much fuel I put in, it was more than before, and with 3 injectors in each engine operational, it went a lot faster. I wanted to look over all the gauges and their telltale needles when I got home, but if all went well, I knew I'd have to load up 5 gallons of fuel for the next test, which would include all 4 injectors in each engine. After checking out everything at home and being satisfied everything worked as it was supposed to, I knew the next test would be full power. I decided to wait until I had a chance to look at the 8mm film before I tried a full power test. I think I said earlier, I'm a careful guy. A few weeks later, I got the process film and learned it was useless. The resolution of 8mm movies is so poor, one could barely make out I was filming gauges in the window of a van. There was no way one could make out the movement of the needles in the gauges. You could barely tell they were gauges, let alone read the needles. I sort of expected that, but I hoped if I looked at it one frame at a time, I would be able to see the needle positions. I couldn't. Then I began what would become a series of full power tests. I must admit, I really tired of the refueling process. Normal propyl nitrate smells terrible, and the ponderous process of extracting the fuel from the 55-gallon drum and transferring it to a small container, then transferring it to the 5-gallon tank in the van became a dreaded task. I repeated the short drive to the Bensenville freight yards about a dozen times. Yes, the boom was significant, but I guess I was getting used to it because that wasn't what surprised me. Perhaps it was because of the dreaded fuel transfer process, but the thing that surprised me most was how rapidly the fuel was consumed during the tests. I mean, it took me more than an hour to refuel the test stand, and when I pushed the button, the fuel was gone in 5 seconds. Gone, empty. I really didn't seem possible. 5 gallons is a fair amount of liquid, and somehow all 5 gallons was forced through the various fuel lines, solenoid valves, and check valves at an alarming rate. Yes, it was loud, but more impressive was realizing 5 gallons of fuel vaporized in 5 seconds. Talking about a release of energy is one thing. Experiencing it is quite another. As I continued my work with these Turbonique thrust motors successfully, I knew it was time to construct the bike that would be powered by them. Oh, it wasn't that I hadn't been working on it, I had, but I wanted the machine to be spectacular for what I had in mind. I would have liked to conduct more tests, but my fuel supply was getting low and I was having trouble finding more. I wasn't really worried. I mean, normal propyl nitrate is a chemical, and if one had enough money, I was sure some chemical company would make it. First, I had to have a presentable machine that I felt had a chance to attract network television cameras. I was happy with my test stand, and it worked well, but it certainly wasn't presentable as a public attraction. Remember, that's what I had in mind. Performance is a part of it, of course, but more important, I had to create something that would turn heads. I had to disassemble it and reconfigure the pieces as a motorcycle in which every part would be polished, painted, or plated, or anodized. While I was working on it, someone mentioned they knew someone who bought a Turbonique motor and never used it. Would I be interested in it? Maybe. Depends on what he bought. As I recall, and this was about 50 years ago, so I don't remember the details, I checked out what the guy had. It was a 50 horsepower shaft output Turbonique motor, the smallest shaft output motor Turbonique made. Yes, I wanted it. The wheel-driven Turbonique drag bike hadn't left my mind, but the tests with the big thrust motors got my attention and respect. I thought it would be a good idea to learn how to deal with the smallest Turbonique shaft output motor before pulling the trigger on the 1,000 horsepower unit. The 1,000 horsepower motor had 2 spark plugs and 2 tractor coils, 4 fuel injectors, 2 oxygen injectors, and so on. The big thrust motors had 8 fuel injectors, 2 oxygen injectors, 4 spark plugs, and 4 coils. The 50 horsepower motor had 1 spark plug, 1 coil, 1 fuel injector, 1 oxygen injector. In short, a much simpler, smaller motor and smaller energy release to deal with. I thought it would make a perfect practice machine. By this time, I'd heard NASA requires 500 rocket motor test firings before a human being is put at risk. I understood. One couldn't possibly stand by those Turbonique thrust motors in my van when I fired them without developing a real respect for what you're dealing with. I sure couldn't afford 500 tests. I mean, that's a lot of fuel, which I didn't have. But it does point out the need to truly understand these motors before throwing a leg over them. Somehow I felt the 50 horsepower motor would be a terrific learning tool without risking one's life. I told you, I'm a careful person. After I got the 50 horsepower stuff, I could see it was the same as the 1,000 horsepower motor, but completely different. I mean, the operating principle was exactly the same. Ignite normal propyl nitrate in a combustion chamber and use the pressure developed to drive a turbine wheel, but the 50 horsepower engine used a series of spur gears to reduce the smaller turbine wheel speed of 92,000 RPM to a manageable 6,000 RPM output shaft speed. The 1,000 horsepower engine used a much cooler planetary gear reduction system. I guess it doesn't really matter. The idea is to end up with a usable output shaft speed. Everything about the 50 horsepower motor was the same, just smaller. You know, I probably shouldn't say it like that because the motors themselves look quite different. I'm talking about the other stuff. The nitrogen bottle was smaller, the oxygen bottle was much smaller, the fuel tank was much smaller. The motor itself was also much smaller, and it was similar to the early Turbonique designs in an all-important area. The early Turbonique shaft output motors had turbine wheels with the buckets located at a right angle to the wheel. If you look closely at this picture, you can see what I'm talking about. The turbine wheel buckets are at a right angle to the wheel itself. For those not familiar with turbine engines, I think of the turbine wheel like an old-fashioned water-driven wheel common for centuries for powering grain mills. The water that is higher than the wheel is guided to fall on the water wheel buckets. As it fills the buckets, the weight of the water turns the wheel and the water fills the next bucket, and so on and so forth. Those early mills were actually turbine driven. The water wheel is the turbine, and the shaft going through the center of the water wheel is connected to and powers the machinery that does the work inside the mill. The early and smaller Turbonique engine used this design right up to and including the 850 horsepower motor. The big difference in the 1,000 horsepower Turbonique shaft output motor is the design of the turbine wheel. The 1,000 horsepower engine has the buckets located radially around the outer edge of the wheel, visible in this picture of a damaged 1,000 horsepower Turbonique turbine wheel. It's too bad Gene Middlebrooks was chased out of the Turbonique business. I would have liked to ask him about the change in turbine wheel designs, you know, advantages and disadvantages, etc. Of course, as you might expect, it's way too late now. Gene passed away August 4th, 2005. It's really too bad, in my opinion, an underappreciated genius. Okay, back to the task in front of me. How to use this 50 horsepower Turbonique motor to learn how to deal with Turbonique motors and normal propyl nitrate. Remember, everything is the same, just smaller and less of it. Let me see if I can point out what I mean. First of all, the combustion chamber. Smaller and located differently, but an empty chamber nonetheless. Then the fuel injector, just one. And an oxygen injector to aid starting, just one. Then, of course, a spark plug, again, just one. There is an exhaust. It's shaped differently than the 1,000 horsepower engine, but it does the same thing. On the other side of the engine is the output shaft that turns a number of spur gears inside the gear case to dramatically reduce the 92,000 RPM turbine wheel speed to about 6,000 RPM final output shaft speed. As I looked at the engine, I realized it was about the same size as one of my Bultaco motorcycle engines. It didn't look anything like a Bultaco, but the length was very close to the same, maybe a little bit shorter, which would help for what I had in mind. Oh yeah, what I had in mind was to mount the 50 horsepower Turbonique motor in one of my race bikes. The nice thing about flat track motorcycle racing is the interchangeability of parts. At the time, there were two classes of motorcycles used for professional flat track motorcycle racing. 250s, changed halfway through my career to 360, and 750s. The 250 or 360 referred to engine size via displacement. 250 or 360 meant 250 cc or 360 cc displacement. 750 meant 750 cc displacement. We referred to them as big bikes and little bikes, even though they were both the same size, except for the engine displacement. The big bikes and the little bikes all used the same wheels, the same forks, the same sprockets. Even the brakes, when they had brakes, were interchangeable. Most of us had brake setups we could mount on the oval track wheels. Oh yes, wheels. There were two companies making wheels for the flat track racers, Kennedy and Barnes. The wheels were interchangeable. The front wheel had no provision for brakes. It was just a lightweight spool hub. The rear wheels had a hub to allow us to mount a drive sprocket. The sprocket could be mounted on either side, allowing us to use both sides of the tire. For example, we might use the sprocket on one side for practice and then remove the wheel and sprocket and mount the sprocket on the other side of the wheel so we could have a fresh tire edge to use on the left turns only oval. The mount for the sprocket was a quick change design requiring only one nut to remove or install. The disc brake rotor was the same mount design as the sprocket, so if you used a brake, it could be mounted on either side. If the track needed front brakes, one used a rear wheel on the front, so you could mount a disc brake rotors on either side or both. Everything was interchangeable between big bikes and the little bikes, sometimes referred to as big motor or little motor machines. Here is a picture of a typical short tracker. Notice the wheels, forks, sprockets, brakes. All are interchangeable with a half-miler or big bike. Here's a picture of a big bike or half-miler. Everything is the same as the short track bike, except the engine is 750 cc's on this bike. The reason for this difference is safety. At the time, any track shorter than a half-mile had to use 250s and later 360 cc engines. Half-mile and larger tracks used big motors or 750s. One might refer to their 750 as a half-miler rather than a big motor bike. It's the same thing. I usually had two short track bikes or small motor machines, a frontline bike and a backup. Nobody wanted to drive to Ohio or Kentucky for a race only to blow a motor in practice and not have a backup. Mine were Bultacos, a Spanish motorcycle, but the only thing Bultaco was the engine. There were about a half a dozen flat track motorcycle frame manufacturers. I preferred Champion frames. So, while you are looking at my Bultaco short tracker, the fact is, it's a Champion frame, Cherry forks, Coney shocks, Kennedy wheels, and sprockets. This was typical of most flat trackers because this style of racing requires a specific handling characteristics. I go into all this because, as you might imagine, with at least two short track bikes and two big motor flat trackers, I had lots of flat track stuff. So, as I looked around for what I could use to try this Turbonique motor, you understand, I wanted to use what I had for this experiment. I took one of my Champion frame short trackers and removed the Bultaco engine. I noticed the output sprocket on the Bultaco or on the Turbonique engine was on the right side. This was opposite of the Bultaco, but was easy enough to accommodate by just switching the drive sprocket on the rear wheel to the other side. Not a big deal. What was a big deal was overall gearing. Like every other flat tracker, I had a stack of sprockets to gear for any track I might race. I did the math, and the largest rear sprocket I had was still too tall, as we say, meaning the gear ratio was for high speed, not acceleration, for what I had in mind. My calculations indicated I would have a theoretical top speed of 135 miles an hour. I would have preferred something like 75 miles an hour. To get this, I would have had to create some kind of jackshaft arrangement. There were a couple of larger sprockets available, but they wouldn't even get close. I was using the smallest practical countershaft sprocket and the largest rear sprocket I had, and it was geared for 135 miles an hour. What to do? I thought about it and was reminded about making sure I kept the turbine wheel loaded. Well, this kind of gearing would certainly do that. On the other hand, I wondered if a 50 horsepower engine would even get underway with that kind of gearing. There was a little like putting a very tall gear on a 1970 Triumph Bonneville motorcycle and trying to get underway in top gear. I don't think it would do it, probably burn up a clutch trying. But then the Turbonique doesn't have a clutch, it's direct drive. When I push the button, the motor turns the rear wheel. When I push the bike, the rear wheel turns the turbine. There was no easy way to disconnect the two. I decided not to worry about it. I wanted to try it, and after that, I'd figure out what I needed to do. I went about building my Turbonique-powered short tracker. It wasn't that hard. Bultaco engines are held in the frame by 4 bolts. I created Turbonique engine mounting plates that matched the Bultaco engine, making it easy to install and easy to put the Bultaco motor back in. It was still my backup bike. After installing the Turbonique engine in the frame, I had to make mounts for the Ford tractor coil ignition, a 12-volt battery, fuel solenoid, oxygen solenoid, oxygen bottle, nitrogen bottle, overspeed control I had no confidence in, and, of course, a fuel tank. All in all, I thought it looked pretty good, although now that I look at the picture, I see I used a Bultaco front wheel and brake. I remember at the time it was handy, and grabbing it was easier than taking a front wheel and brake from a race bike. For what I had in mind, this Bultaco brake would be fine. The mechanical front brake handle was quicker and easier than setting up a hydraulic unit. Now I wanted to test it. I decided to put the front wheel against the rear bumper of my van in front of my house and used tie-down straps to secure the bike to the back of my van, almost the same as tying down the bike inside the van, except it was outside. As I looked at the setup, I couldn't help but notice the drive chain. It was a typical 520 motorcycle chain we all used on flat track bikes. My XR750 Harley flat track bike produced 100 horsepower and the chain handled it. Even when riding the XR on a TT, which required a jump, and you had to land after a jump with the power on or risk snapping the front end off the bike, I never broke a chain. Still, I sure didn't want a driveline failure and the possibility of overspeeding the turbine. At the last minute, I decided to put a piece of cardboard under the rear tire to reduce traction. When I pushed the button, the bike immediately spit the piece of cardboard out and spun the rear wheel hard. The cardboard served its purpose of softening the blow to the drive chain. I was glad I did it. In about 10 seconds, it was over. The Turbonique short tracker spun the wheel hard, and I was convinced it had enough power to get underway despite the tall gearing. I spent the rest of the day looking it over to see if I'd broken anything or there were any leaks. There weren't. The bike was fine. Actually, I was pleased. When I pushed the button, everything worked as planned. My uncle from Boston, who is an engineer and holder of several patents, a very sharp guy, was coming to visit during the week, and if possible, I wanted to demonstrate the Turbonique engine when he arrived. I gave him a quick run-through as I fueled the machine. He commented on the terrible smell of normal propyl nitrate. As I went through each step of the procedure to fire the motor, his only comment was, "I hope you know what you're doing." I told him the only thing I'm not familiar with is actually riding the bike. I explained I haven't ridden it yet, but I have fired the motor. I explained the high gearing and that I didn't know what to expect. It could be the engine won't have enough power to move the bike. The gearing is so high, and it is a direct drive. It could be I'll push the button and the machine will just sit there with fire coming out the exhaust. Or it could be the rear wheel will spin violently and I'll have difficulty controlling the bike. I further explained the engine makes 50 horsepower at 0 RPM, and I didn't know how that will feel. I thought that a Triumph Bonneville of the period would make about 50 real horsepower, and I don't think it would get underway if I put it in high gear and rev the hell out of it and dump the clutch. But this was all guesswork. By now, his engineering mind was working, meaning he was as curious as me to see what would happen too. Only one way to find out, I said. I threw a leg over the machine and pushed the button. To my surprise, the bike pulled away smartly. I know it's a stupid word I'm not sure I have ever used before, but that's what came to mind. As I rode down the alley and turned onto the street, I was almost going too fast to make the turn, but I didn't want to turn the motor on and off because of the danger liquid fuel rockets pose. By now, I was really starting to haul ass. The best way I can describe it is the acceleration was linear and constant. I couldn't help but notice the acceleration at speed seemed exactly the same as when it pulled away. Smartly. In a normal motorcycle or car, we're used to the strongest acceleration occurring in first gear because of the torque multiplication of the transmission. When you shift into second, the acceleration is less, but the speed is greater. As you work your way through the gears, the acceleration is less and less. This machine was quite different. The acceleration was strong at the start and never stopped pulling. Somewhere over 70 miles an hour, maybe 80. I'm guessing race bikes don't have speedometers. I ran out of fuel. Of course, I had to walk the bike back. Because it has direct drive, I could hear the turbine wheel spinning as I pushed it back. There wasn't much resistance, but I was young then. I tried to keep every thought I had during the ride in my memory. Far and away, the most noticeable thing was the constant acceleration. I hadn't felt anything like it before. I liked it, and it showed me the value of the Gene Middlebrooks creation. I was glad it was just a 50 horsepower version. This allowed me to experience what Turbonique felt like. I mean, what it felt like to have maximum rated horsepower at 0 RPM. I had to think about it, but it was quite different from any engine I'd experienced before. If it had been the 1,000 horsepower engine, I would have spent every second hanging on for dear life. 50 horsepower was manageable and still impressive, especially as the speed increased and acceleration didn't lessen. I remember thinking just before I ran out of fuel, man, this thing is really getting legs. I was starting to wonder when it would run out of fuel because I was continually gathering speed at the same rate as the first 20 feet. Then the fuel was gone and the ride was over. It was a long time ago, and I still haven't forgotten a second of it. And I suppose my uncle didn't either. Of course, he has since passed away. But we talked about it on the phone often in the years before he passed. I think he wished he were a little bit younger. I didn't understand it at the time. This age thing catches up with all of us. I suppose he was in his 70s at the time and passed in his 90s. Now I'm in my 70s. I get it. The wishing I was young to pursue new ideas part. Getting back to the ride. It was, without a doubt, among the most important Turbonique experiences I had. As it turned out, it helped me understand why Turbonique was so misunderstood. My acquisition of the lowest horsepower rated shaft output Turbonique motor was pure luck and probably something I would not have sought. I mean, come on, I race motorcycles professionally. Why on earth would I want the lowest rated motor a company produced? As it turned out, it helped me understand Turbonique characteristics. This idea of producing maximum power and torque at 0 RPM was difficult to get your head around. Certainly unlike anything I'd ridden or driven before. And really important. As a matter of fact, if Turbonique were still around after I had the experience, I would have purchased another shaft output motor, perhaps something in the 200 horsepower area. By the way, I keep saying 50 horsepower, but several versions of the Turbonique publications indicate 45 horsepower instead of 50. Still others indicate 50 horsepower. It's not really important except to show Turbonique was a bit careless with the claims in their advertisements. I'm not saying they exaggerated, not at all. They were just careless. Whether it was actually 45 or 50 horsepower isn't important. What was important was understanding the rated power occurred at 0 RPM, and this was something that needed attention, serious attention. I'm sure if I had just built the 1,000 horsepower drag bike, I would have found that every time I pushed the button, I would have been treated to a rear wheel violently spinning, unable to find traction, and probably difficult, if not impossible, to control. Perhaps I would have dismissed Turbonique as an off and on switch. The value of the 50 horsepower motor experience was it didn't have enough power with the gearing I used to spin the rear wheel. This allowed me to feel the power and the way Turbonique delivered it. This was extremely valuable for me as I realized more engineering was needed to take advantage of what Turbonique offered. Just like in the early days of top fuel dragsters, I'd have to come up with a way to get the enormous power to the rear wheel and inevitably to the ground without violently spinning the wheel. Something along the lines of a slipper clutch arrangement or perhaps some kind of fluid coupling. My experience with the 50 horsepower motor showed me Turbonique provided all the power advertised, whether it was 45 or 50 or 1,000. But learning how to use that power and its characteristics was going to be a technical challenge. Had Turbonique survived, I think the way to develop the driveline to suit Turbonique's power characteristics would be to start with the lower horsepower motors and develop the drag bike and its driveline to take maximum advantage of the power and lightness Turbonique offered and the way it delivered it. Think about it. If I had it to do over again, I would take the Turbonique short tracker to the Grove and get some numbers, ET in mile per hour. My guess would be about 85 miles an hour and about 14 or 15 seconds. Now, as any good drag racer knows, the next step would be to change the gearing so I'd get to maximum RPM about 100 feet before the finish line. Of course, this would be super interesting because Turbonique gets full power at 0 RPM. I'm not sure if the same strategy I used for best elapsed time in mile per hour with my 650 BSA would be best for Turbonique, but it would be a good place to start. I would guess the 50 horsepower Turbonique short tracker geared properly would be good for about a high 12 and 100 miles an hour. More important, I'd know how the motor performed properly geared. Would the rear wheel spin with the dramatically improved torque multiplication proper gearing offered? Would the wheel spin most of the way down the track? I don't know. But don't forget, maximum power at 0 RPM. Anyway, the idea would be to get the most out of the small Turbonique motored short tracker, then add more power and go through the process again. It would be easy, getting more power, that is. Here's what I mean. This is a picture of a go-kart powered by the same Turbonique motor I had in my short tracker. Notice they have incorporated some kind of jack shaft arrangement along with a very small circumference wheel tire arrangement. This would have provided much more acceleration than my 135 mile per hour gearing. As a matter of fact, I was told this cart violently spun both rear wheels as long as they kept the button pushed. They eventually gave up on it because of the violent wheel spin. What I want you to look at is the combustion chamber. It's the same as mine. Now, before I show you the next picture, look closely at the gearbox. It's the same as mine. An arrangement of spur gears in a gear case, reducing the 92,000 RPM turbine wheel speed to 6,000 RPM output shaft speed. Got it memorized? Now, look at this picture of the 360 horsepower Turbonique motor. Notice anything the same? More important, notice anything different? Obviously, the combustion chamber is the difference. It looks like one could easily just change combustion chambers to change horsepower output. The gearbox appears to be identical. It's too bad Gene Middlebrooks isn't still around. I have questions. What kind of questions? Well, how about the idea of bleeding off some of the pressure created in the gas generator? I'm sorry, that's rocket science talk. Let's keep calling it a combustion chamber. Either one is correct. It's just a matter of who you're talking to. We're car guys. Combustion chamber is fine. So, if the problem is excessive pressure in the combustion chamber creating excessive power at the output shaft, how about bleeding off some of the pressure, at least until you are half track? It really won't work. These engines are designed to operate at 300 pounds of combustion chamber pressure. Bleeding off pressure won't lower pressure because the rocket motor will keep feeding in fuel to maintain that 300 pounds regardless of what you do with it. At least that's what I'm told. I still have some ideas along those lines, like perhaps something like a prony brake absorbing some of the energy until, say, half track. Yes, you would have a very hot brake rotor, but this is drag racing, and absorbing excess energy is only for a couple of seconds. It's an idea I'd like to try. One thing is sure, I had to solve this problem to have a successful wheel-driven Turbonique drag bike. 1,000 horsepower will easily light up that slick I was so proud of for the entire quarter mile. Solving technical problems is what we're here for. I have a couple of ideas, but all require testing. There is no question in my mind. I had to finish the Turbonique thrust-powered drag bike first to get it on the racetrack in a reasonable amount of time. The thrust bike doesn't require a drivetrain, and there is no concern about keeping the turbine loaded. There is no turbine, thus no concern about overspeeding the turbine wheel. Speed of construction was important to me. My wife's condition had deteriorated dramatically. Without going into detail, she went from occasional limping to using a cane to a walker and finally a wheelchair in about 6 years. I would learn how unpredictable multiple sclerosis was. Some people show very few symptoms. Some show a limp or perhaps slurred speech and never get any worse. Unfortunately, that was not the case for Sharon. It was beyond frustrating. As a person who thinks he can fix anything, it was an agony to watch her deteriorate, and regardless of what I tried, it didn't help. I bought her an electric start 3-wheel vehicle and removed the basket shown on the back in this picture. I replaced the basket with a rack I engineered to hold her wheelchair. It was arranged in such a way that she could easily slide the wheelchair into the rack and it would self-lock in place. It worked, but only for perhaps a year or so when her condition worsened and she could no longer manage the wheelchair. At the time, President Nixon reopened relations with China. It was a big deal in the political world back then. The part I found interesting was what at the time was sort of a Chinese secret called acupuncture. The first Chinese delegation to the United States included Chinese acupuncturists. I thought maybe this might help her. Nobody knew. Doctors, multiple sclerosis organizations, nobody. There didn't seem to be anything to lose. She could no longer walk and her tremors were getting worse. I was still working for United Airlines and my sister was a nurse. I arranged for travel for them to Washington, D.C. after securing an appointment for Sharon with the visiting acupuncturist. My sister was a very capable medical professional and agreed to take her. Unfortunately, like so many other things that some thought might help with multiple sclerosis, acupuncture had no effect. I don't remember if she was in Washington, D.C. for 1 week or 2, but it had no effect while she was there receiving treatments. When she returned, I hoped maybe with a little time there would be improvement. There wasn't. For me, this was more pressure to get a Turbonique drag bike on the track. The driveline challenges of the wheel-driven machine would have to wait. I needed to redouble my efforts to get the thrust-powered machine finished. Yeah, I know. It seems unrelated, but to me it wasn't. Let's see if I can explain. Everyone involved in motorsport eventually has to make a decision. The decision is about the time, energy, and resources required to participate in motorsport, and if one can continue to divert time, energy, and resources from their family to something that can never return revenue. Perhaps the wealthy can do it as a sort of hobby, but the average middle-class person must decide if he can deny his family to pursue his passion. For me, there was no choice. I knew my interest and, yes, passion for motorsport drove me internally, and there was that inner feeling that it should be possible for those so inclined to generate revenue from this activity. It was possible in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Why not now? Once again, I was back to the realization we were being cheated by television out of a fair opportunity to compete in the sports entertainment marketplace. Yes, I suppose most would and did bail out in favor of taking care of their family. I chose the other path, fix the problem. Yes, that's the decision I was talking about. Get out or go after the problem. It was obvious to me I couldn't help my wife much. We would have to live with multiple sclerosis. So the choice was easier. If I'd had children, I probably couldn't have pursued the thought. Few men could look at the little mouths to feed and spend their resources on racing. In many ways, I thought I was the ideal person to do it. I had no children. My needs were small. I had the ability to speak, and while there were many who understood and excelled at motorsport activities, very few had the ability to verbalize the experience. I did. How accurate any of this is unimportant. What was important, as far as I knew, I was the only one willing to do it, to challenge the status quo and devote myself to the effort. And what was the effort? To raise public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation of the motorsport community and their activities. Let me say it again. To raise public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation of the motorsport community and their activities. Sounds simple enough. But how does one do that in late 20th and early 21st century America? If this were a late 19th or early 20th century problem, one might consider a whistle-stop campaign. For those too young to remember whistle-stop campaigns, that would include me, by the way, the dictionary defines a whistle-stop campaign as a political campaign in which a politician makes short stops at many different towns. The expression was first used in the United States, where small American towns were called whistle stops because trains only stopped at them if a whistle signal was given. If you still don't understand, how about whistle stop as a noun? A small, unimportant town along a railroad line. A short talk from the rear platform of a train, especially during a political campaign. A brief appearance, a single performance, or the like, in a small town as during a political campaign, or even a theatrical tour. Get the idea? A whistle-stop campaign was a way of communicating in America prior to the technical development of mass communications, like radio. Obviously, if it's a slow, tedious way to reach people, but if that's all there is, that's what you do, especially when one considers there are almost always competing voices trying to be heard. It's okay when the competing voices all have to do the same thing. At least it's a level playing field. When radio came along, it pretty much ended the era of the whistle-stop campaign. Radio was faster and reached far more people than could ever be reached talking to a crowd from the back of a train at whistle stops. But radio was different in a very important way. Only a privileged, wealthy few were allowed to speak on the public airwaves by law, eliminating any possibility of a level playing field. The poor were left out, and the ability of the wealthy to influence was greatly enhanced. The whistle-stop arrangement was slow and ponderous, but at least everyone could do it. Now, don't change the channel. I see you reaching for the remote. I promise I won't go through it all again. We've already talked many times about the deal with the devil America made in 1927 with the radioactive 1927. Like most deals with the devil, it was made with the best of intentions, without regard to the old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. While we've talked endlessly about the technical reasons access to our airwaves had to be limited in order for a radio, meaning broadcast, to exist, the consequences of that deal with the devil is almost never discussed, in all likelihood because those few who do get to talk and be heard like it that way. So how could you possibly expect to hear about consequences? Those who get to talk are hardly interested in the views or complaints of those who are denied by law. Oh, some oddballs perhaps on some obscure public access cable TV show featuring pretty girls in cute, colorful costumes talking about cars might do some bitching about it. But so what? I mean, who's going to take that seriously? Oh, by the way, don't worry about whether I'm taken seriously or not. Trust me, we have bigger problems. Being taken seriously is well down the road. First, we have to be noticed. I've never worried about being taken seriously. Anyone who has ever known me for more than 10 minutes takes me seriously. But in an America whose only viable communication system is controlled by the government and its wealthy supporters, our problem isn't being taken seriously. It's being noticed. Oh, you're wondering what I mean by deal with the devil? Okay, I don't think we've beaten this to death yet, so I'll briefly explain. I promise, briefly. I haven't forgotten Turbonique. I'll get back to it. The deal with the devil to which I refer is the legislation called the Radio Act of 1927 and later the Communications Act of 1934, which essentially restated the Radio Act of 1927 and created the FCC to enforce the provisions of that legislation. Okay, how is that a deal with the devil? Good question. Our country prides itself on guaranteeing free speech to all of its citizens. It's the very first amendment to our Constitution which would seem to underline its importance. Yet, the Radio Act of 1927 denies nearly the entire population meaningful free speech. Now, why on earth would a country that claims to value free speech so highly that it made the guarantee of free speech the leading part of its Constitution give it up? Why indeed? Why would we do that? And who would agree to it? The answer is, and this is an old story, a shiny new object was held up to us as trade, something we could not resist, something for which we were willing to sacrifice our unique free speech guarantee. And what was that shiny new object? Broadcast. Radio at the time, today television. It's all broadcast. The almost magical ability to talk to the entire nation at the same time. A far cry from a whistle-stop campaign, a power one could only imagine in the late 19th and early 20th century. The power to decide who our national leaders would be, the power to dictate which products would succeed. Unimaginable power. The only thing you had to do was agree to give up free speech. The technical limitations of broadcast required that only a tiny few could use it, or it wouldn't work. Certainly something I would have never agreed to, although it's difficult to criticize those who did. After all, in 1927 or even 1934, who could have predicted television? Words and pictures in front of the entire population for 5 or 6 hours a day, every day. A far cry from standing on the back of a train at whistle stops. You know, unimportant towns along rail lines where the train only stops if a whistle is blown. In a whistle stop, one got to talk to anywhere from 4 or 5 people to hundreds of people. And sometimes those seeking to be heard made as many as a half a dozen whistle stops a day in their effort to influence a nation. Broadcast was pure magic for those who struggled to be heard. The only problem is the magic was black magic, and buried in its soul was a poison pill. It only works if only a tiny few use it, meaning the United States of America no longer had free speech. A deal with the devil. We traded our treasured free speech so we could watch Howdy Doody and Dave Garroway. Like every great deal with the devil, it seemed like a bargain at the time. Nobody really had anything to say, and Howdy Doody and Dave Garroway were fun, and everybody loved them. An easy trade to make, or so it seemed. It would be decades before we realized what we'd done. And by giving up free speech, it couldn't be undone. How could one speak out and be heard? It was no longer possible. We traded away our right to speak and be heard so we could watch Howdy Doody and Dave Garroway and, I suppose, Three's Company. So we now live in a country influenced entirely by a small handful of wealthy people. Make no mistake about it, there are no poor people on television. The voices you hear are the voices of the wealthy and privileged. Think about what that might mean. While you're thinking, I have to get back to my Turbonique story. I promised. I don't believe it. Once again, time is getting away from me. We're close to being out of time, and I still have much to say. Of course, I'd like to have more time to spend on the television problem, because if we don't solve that, there is no point in talking about motorsport at all. The subject is as dead as a doornail. Even something as technically interesting as Turbonique. As stated, I decided to finish the Turbonique thrust-powered drag bike first. The lack of a need for developing a driveline capable of making use of what the Turbonique shaft output motors had to offer made building the thrust machine considerably more compelling. Actually, I remember thinking, it was just a matter of rearranging the parts I had in the van test stand. It should be easy. It wasn't. While I didn't have to worry about somehow capturing 1,000 horsepower and using it to drive a rear wheel in a manageable way, there were significant problems I had to address. For example, the frame would have to be super strong, not because there was going to be any twisting force trying to distort it as there would be with a wheel-driven machine. The fact was, I was going to need to stop the machine from speeds never before achieved on a motorcycle. To begin with, this meant I was going to need front brakes superior to anything used on a motorcycle before. In addition, I needed to design the frame with significant gusseting at the steering head to ward off any tendency for the front end to shudder under hard braking. Of course, the front wheel would be responsible for 90% of the braking, and all of whatever force that might generate had to travel through the steering head. I decided to use Timken tapered roller bearings to support the front end where it hinges to the frame, and that's the steering head. These preloaded steering head bearings should stabilize the front end under hard braking. My concern about this led me to cut the triple clamps out of magnesium tooling plate, light and strong, with the emphasis on strong. As I write this, nearly 40 years after I built the machine, I realize many things have changed. For example, if I were to do it today, 2020, there are many motorcycle road racing and superbike frames with super strong front ends that would provide the stability I anticipated I'd need, along with superior braking systems. But this was 40 years ago, and those things did not exist. For brakes, I selected Lockheed magnesium calipers from England. They were commonly used on formula cars in Europe. I chose wheels featuring straight pull spokes. Yes, I knew the then new cast wheels might be stronger, but in my mind, the bike needed spoked wheels to not be dismissed as a space project. Spoke wheels are traditional on a motorcycle and have the look needed to be considered a motorcycle. Of course, none of this would be of any value if the frame wasn't as strong as an anvil. The last thing I needed was a dreaded speed wobble under braking. To that end, the frame is entirely constructed from 4130 chrome moly tubing, and the steering head area is gusseted with 4130 chrome moly plate. While weight is always a consideration in racing, I considered the steering head area as a critical strength area. Weight was less important than strength. I was well aware the front brake would be the primary stopping device, but I was playing around with the idea of using a parachute. While using a parachute to stop a top-fuel drag bike today is almost commonplace, 40 years ago it had never been done. The only person I knew of who had ever used a parachute to stop a bike was Don Vesco with his Bonneville Streamliner. I called him and asked what he thought of the idea of using a parachute to stop a drag bike. He said a chute will knock off 100 miles an hour like you hit a wall, but bikes are so light, if there is any crosswind, the chute will drag you all over. I gave it a lot of thought. It seemed to me the idea of a chute was a good one. The only thing was, the only person who had any experience with a parachute on a bike was cautioning me about something that needed attention. Don Vesco was a person I listened to. I finally decided I needed to devise a parachute I could deploy, then release, if need be. There was something else too. With no parachute on a bike experience, I realized I needed to figure out where on the bike the parachute should be attached. I remember jet cars having a problem with using a chute. They had the unique problem of having a lot of fire and thrust coming out of the back right where the parachute had to deploy. I remember seeing a picture of a jet car after the finish line with the front wheels a couple of feet off the ground, caused by the anchor point of the chute being too high on the rear of the car, so the chute could clear the thrust coming out of the back. And the deployed chute, with all of that leverage, yanked the front of the car off the ground. It seemed to me the ideal chute anchor point on this bike would be at the rear axle center line. But how to do it? The final solution to the chute problem was to create a loop out of 4130 chrome moly tubing that would be attached to the bike's frame at the rear axle center line. The attachment points on each side of the bike used heim joints so the loop could swing from the attachment points at the rear axle. The idea being the chute, when deployed, would carry the top of the loop toward the back of the machine, then pull on the machine from the rear axle center line. In addition, the loop had a sliding pin at the top of its arch that the parachute strap attached to. This meant there were two parachute control handles on the left handlebar, one to deploy the chute and one to slide the pin, which would release the chute should it prove necessary. It seemed to be a practical solution, but of course, it remains to be seen how well it will work. I was working on a machine that may very well exceed 400 miles an hour. How any of what I was making would work was all a matter of testing and re-engineering what proved to need re-engineering. As always, we're out of time too soon, with only enough left to thank John Platania and Pete Bellender for helping me in the studio taping these pieces to create this edition of Motorsports Unlimited. We'll pick up on this subject next time in Explanation 20. Me, I'm Bill Wildt. Thanks for watching.
This program made possible in part by support from ABC Auto Parts, located on Ashland Avenue at 138th Street in Blue Island, Illinois.
Motorsports Unlimited is produced by Bill Wildt, president of the Motorsport Advancement Crusade.
This program made possible in part by support from Jimmy's Red Hots, located on Grant Avenue and Pulaski Road in Chicago.
Motorsports Unlimited was created to raise public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation of the motorsport community and their activities. You can contact us by email at msutv.com or email us directly at msutv@aol.com. We enjoy hearing from our audience and encourage you to let us know what you think. Now, this is not one of our usual next weeks promoting next week's program. This is a reminder that Motorsports Unlimited is now global on YouTube. Simply subscribe to Bill Wildt Motorsports Unlimited on YouTube and watch us anytime.
So that's it, another edition of Motorsports Unlimited and the lovely ladies of motorsports. And be with us next week because we'll have something real exciting. Bill Wildt's going to have the lovely ladies, and just about anything can happen right here on Motorsports Unlimited. Every week at this time, we bring you the best in motorsports. So be seeing ya. Bye-bye. And keep on rocking.